it's really an important time to be thinking about conflict and thinking about conflict prevention. And so partly this presentation comes from a series of presentations that I presented in Indonesia in July, based on a paper that was commissioned by Australia's Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, that was written by myself and some colleagues, Professor Metcalfe from the National Security College at the Australian National University, and Dr. Huang Le from the International Crisis Group. We were asked by Australia to present a paper outlining some options for conflict prevention and thinking seriously about how to use ASEAN-centered mechanisms in order to deal with some of the more significant or pressing urgent issues that relate to conflict in our region. So this presentation today is based on that report, and the slide says that it's a draft report, but actually the report is out, and after I finish speaking, I'll put the link to the report in the chat, and I would be happy for all participants to go and have a look at that report if they are interested in this presentation. So thank you again for the opportunity to be able to talk about this report. It reflects Australia's interest in developing a regional conflict prevention agenda in order to be able to navigate some of the real complex issues that our region is experiencing at the moment. So just as an overview, I'm going to talk about conflict prevention in theory and practice. I'm going to move on to focusing on ASEAN-centered institutions and the relationship between ASEAN and conflict prevention. I mean, conflict prevention and preventative diplomacy are really at the core of ASEAN, its history and its purpose. And then I'm going to finish with some recommendations. And during our Q&A, I'd be really interested to hear any views that people in the audience might have about these recommendations. So just to set the scene and think about the regional context, the risk of interstate conflict in Asia are real, and they are growing, unfortunately. And the Indo-Pacific today faces an increasingly volatile strategic environment. There are escalating tensions across the Taiwan Strait. There are tensions in the South China Sea, and there are a range of other flashpoints, including in the East China Sea, Korean Peninsula, and between India and Pakistan, that might lead to armed clashes, which would be disastrous for the region, but it also could lead to humanitarian, economic, and environmental crises with consequences far beyond the combatants that might be involved in such a conflict. One of the real concerns I think that governments are focused on is the very real risk of conflict that involves the great powers. So thinking in particular the United States and China. And such a conflict involving China and the US would have grave consequences for the region. So part of what my colleagues, Rory and Huang, and I were tasked with was to try to think about a conflict prevention agenda that could prevent the very worst of conflict involving great powers in our region. So we have regional institutions that were built to prevent such conflict, especially the ASEAN-centered mechanisms, such as the ASEAN Regional Forum, the East Asia Summit, and the ASEAN Defence Ministers Meeting Plus. But part of the issue is that these institutions are not engaging with the urgency that the moment demands. So our discussion focuses on a simple but urgent question, and that is, how can we prevent conflicts before they erupt into war? So I'm going to start with the concept of conflict prevention. So conflict prevention often entails slow, patient diplomacy, and success is often measured by the crises that do not occur. So it can be difficult to measure when you're measuring things that have not actually happened. But at a time when the risk of catastrophic conflict is rising, it might be one of the most important forms of statecraft that is currently available to us. So when we talk about conflict prevention, we are really talking about foresight. It is the ability to manage tensions early using political and diplomatic tools to avoid catastrophic escalation. So in our region, where flashpoints such as the Taiwan Strait or the South China Sea might quickly draw in the major powers, the ability to prevent conflict is essential to thinking about statecraft. At its core, conflict prevention refers to proactive efforts to maintain peace and stability by addressing the drivers of organised violence before they escalate into armed conflict. And armed conflict can span a spectrum. These conflict prevention tools, it can mean tackling deep structural causes of instability. It can mean managing crises in real time. It can also extend to post-conflict scenarios where the goal is to prevent a relapse into armed violence. So the concept of conflict prevention itself is contested. Some focus on quite narrowly on interstate conflict, so conflict between countries and between militaries, but others also include sub-state threats like insurgencies or terrorism. Our analysis in this paper really zeroes in on interstate tensions in Asia, where the risks of confrontation between major powers are the most consequential. And our paper looks at three categories along the escalation ladder. The first, we look at crisis, which refers to high stakes, fast-moving situations that might risk sliding into war. For example, the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, which is one of the most well-known historical examples of crisis and crisis management. But in the Asian region, we're also seeing the increased use of what many refer to as grey zone activities. These are coercive and often illegal tactics that fall below the threshold of war. We can think in terms of cyber attacks or disinformation, the use of maritime harassment through Coast Guard or through the use of maritime militia, or
Sorry,
incremental territorial encroachments. Yes?
Prof. Beck, sorry, your slide not play in our Zoom meeting.
Oh, have you lost the slide?
Yes, it's still a first year slide.
Oh, okay. I'm
Okay.
sorry. I'm on to slide 4.
Okay.
Maybe I will stop share and try sharing again. So the slides haven't flicked over.
Yes.
Please
Uh,
play the
please repeat your
please
slide,
please
stop
play the
share,
PowerPoint.
and
Sorry?
then share again.
Yes, I'll stop sharing and I'll share again, and hopefully
Okay.
this might work. Although I did send my slides over, so maybe they could be shared from your end, and I'll just ask when the slides.
Okay. Our committee, please help Mr. Beck, sorry, Prof. Beck for slideshow. Sorry, Prof. Beck.
No, that's okay. From my screen, they appear to be ticking over, but there must be something happening with the slide share. Ah, perfect. Thank you. We
The
are
fourth
on
slide,
to
please.
slide 5. Thank you.
Five
Oh, slide
or
4.
four?
Sorry.
Okay, four.
So if we could, perfect. That's where we go. If we can go back to slide 4, perfect. Yes. So I was just talking about degrees of interstate conflict, crisis, managing crisis, trying to prevent conflict from emerging from crisis situations. Grey zone activities, so how to deal with coercive actions that fall below the threshold of warfare. And the third part of the escalation ladder is international armed conflict. So in a word, war. This is what we're trying to prevent, the most severe form of conflict involving the organised use of armed forces, which remains the most devastating form of conflict. So the flashpoints of greatest concern, as I mentioned before, are those that could directly involve China and the United States, particularly around Taiwan, the South China Sea, and the East China Sea. The effects of such conflict would not stop at the battlefield. They would have grave consequences across the entire Indo-Pacific, which means that we have a sense of urgency around the importance of states thinking through options for conflict prevention through statecraft and through regional cooperation and collaboration. If I can go to the next slide. Perfect. So today, the geopolitical environment is deteriorating. States are once again using force to achieve political goals, although they might not necessarily be using military. They might be using paramilitary forces or other actors in order to try to defend their national interests or advance their strategic ends. And we also know that norms that have underpinned peace since 1945 are also under considerable strain in the international community. And defence planners, certainly those in my own country of Australia, now speak of the loss of warning time. Militaries are operating in closer proximity, which increases the risk of accidents or of miscalculation. As a result, conflict prevention must address 2 fundamental objectives. The first is to prevent accidental conflict by reducing misunderstanding and miscalculation. And the second is preventing deliberate conflict. So not all conflict arises through accidents, but by discouraging risk-taking and aggression, a conflict prevention agenda needs to make it clear particularly to great powers about the damage that aggressive and risk-taking actions cause. Next slide, please. So it helps to think of conflict not as a single event, but rather as a cycle, a dynamic, non-linear, and often recurring cycle. If I can go on to the next slide, I think I've got a picture here. So conflicts can simmer, they can flare up, they can subside, they can reignite. Prevention, therefore, does need to be continuous and adaptive. It is not a one-off response. But our focus here is on the pre-conflict phase, preventing strategic competition from turning into crisis and preventing crisis from turning into war. And this phase, the pre-conflict phase, really involves early action, identifying grievances, engaging in dialogue, and creating conditions for trust and to encourage restraint. So one of the most important concepts or tools that we have in the toolbox is preventive diplomacy. Next slide, please. So preventive diplomacy is a concept that was formalized in 1992 in the then UN Secretary General's Agenda for Peace, which defined preventative diplomacy as action to stop disputes from arising, to prevent existing disputes from escalating, and to limit their spread. So preventive diplomacy is inherently proactive. It relies on diplomatic, political, and institutional tools that include things like early engagement, dialogue, and cooperative mechanisms to stop tensions from becoming violent. While they're usually associated with states, preventive diplomacy is increasingly involving non-state actors, including civil society, independent experts and academics, and former leaders. So this broad multi-level approach recognises that preventing conflict requires inclusion, agility, and coordination across different parts of society. And it doesn't just involve foreign ministries, but increasingly involves actors like academics who might be involved in preventative diplomacy at what we call the track 2 level. So there are a number of tools of conflict prevention that can be grouped into 4 broad categories. The first is early prevention and confidence building. So at the earliest stage, the goal is to create conditions for peace and predictability. So we have confidence building measures, or CBMs, that include transparency initiatives, information sharing, developing hotlines in order to try to prevent misunderstandings from happening between key leaders. This stage can also involve norm and institution building. And this seeks to embed habits of cooperation and dispute resolution, and are particularly important in regional frameworks. And I'll talk a little bit about ASEAN here later. So this is the sort of the first category, early prevention and confidence building. And then the second category we can think about in terms of early warning mechanisms and risk identification. So prevention depends on knowing where trouble is brewing. Early warning mechanisms use data and analysis to try to detect risks. These can include political instability, economic shocks, environmental stress. We can think of platforms like international crisis groups, Crisis Watch, or the Council on Foreign Relations Global Conflict Tracker as global examples of trying to share knowledge about impending crises. Regionally, the challenge is to develop similar mechanisms within ASEAN-centred institutions, to develop what currently exists, to try to identify and flag risks before crises spiral. The third broad category in preventive diplomacy is crisis management and preventive action. So when tensions escalate, diplomacy needs to become much more direct. And this can include through the use of mediation or special envoys or the use of good officers to try to facilitate dialogue. Fact-finding missions can help establish objective understanding of violence or of events, while preventative deployment of observers or peacekeepers can also help to try to deter violence, provided there is, of course, states' consent. So the goal here is to try to de-escalate a crisis before it crosses over into armed conflict. And finally, the fourth category of preventive diplomacy tools is structural prevention and capacity building. So long-term prevention of violence requires actors to address root causes of violence. These can include things like inequality, weak governance, historical grievances, or competition over resources. All of these root causes can spiral into crisis or spiral into armed conflict. So long-term prevention really requires addressing these root causes. And this can include through strengthening institutions, supporting more inclusive forms of governance, and improving the capacity of institutions and states to respond quickly to crisis. In the interstate context, structural prevention often means institutionalizing habits of dialogue and cooperation and restraint through the use of agreements, transparency, and dialogue. And next slide, please. And it's important to note that in our paper, we think that deterrence is an important part of conflict prevention. Sometimes what happens in these discussions is there's an idea that conflict prevention and diplomacy happens over here and military deterrence happens over here. But actually, military deterrence is a necessary part of conflict prevention. It is not the opposite of prevention, it is actually part of it. So credible deterrence can discourage aggression by raising the costs of conflict. It's designed to get states, leaders, and militaries to think twice about using military force. But it must be balanced with reassurance and communication in order to avoid escalation or in order to avoid arms races or security dilemmas from emerging. So in short, diplomacy and deterrence can be considered as being two sides of the same coin. Both can be presented as tools of conflict prevention when they are used wisely and transparently. So this must be done carefully to avoid misperception or militarization that can undermine trust and stability. But certainly in our paper, we consider deterrence to be an important part of the conflict prevention toolbox. Next slide, please. So just before I get to ASEAN and to sort of wrap up this first section on the theories and practices of conflict diplomacy, we also in our report identified some of the key ingredients in successful preventative diplomacy. And there are 4 key ingredients. The first, there needs to be a shared normative framework. There needs to be a common vision. There needs to be some agreed upon definitions about what we're talking about and some agreed upon rules. So a shared normative framework is very important for successful preventive diplomacy according to the historical cases that we looked at. The second is that there needs to be operational mechanisms. So there needs to be actual concrete mechanisms that actors are able to use when it comes to things like early warning or mediation or crisis management tools that can be activated quickly and that actors know that they exist and that they can be used in a situation of crisis. So these are important. Knowing what mechanisms exist for actors is very important. The third key ingredient to successful preventive diplomacy is institutional capacity. We're talking about expertise, we're talking about appropriate resourcing, and we're talking about coordination, particularly between regional actors in coordinating in how they can respond quickly when crises emerge. But above all, one of the most critical things is political will. the readiness of leaders to prioritize long-term stability over short-term advantage. And this is a tricky one for regional conflict prevention, because if we're thinking about trying to prevent conflict between, say, the United States and China, then that requires the United States and China having the political will not to be involved in conflict in the first place. So that's a kind of challenge that we have in using regional institutional mechanisms, is how to find ways of discouraging the most powerful states from using their militaries in ways that would have dire consequences for the rest of the region. So for preventive diplomacy, flexibility is critical, timing matters. We also see the importance of skilled mediators who might be trusted, who might be able to make a difference when a crisis reaches a ripe moment for resolution. So turning now to ASEAN, conflict prevention is a founding purpose of ASEAN itself. This is because ASEAN was born out of, a trauma of post-colonial transitions, proxy wars, and Cold War divisions. The founding members of ASEAN shared a simple but profound commitment to keep peace among themselves and to shield their region from the collateral damage of great power rivalry. And this is an aim that obviously continues to this day. So over the decades, that commitment has evolved into one of the world's most enduring systems of regional multilateral diplomacy, aimed at overcoming mistrust, aimed at managing tensions, and nurturing a shared commitment to peace, stability, and development. If I could have the next slide, please. So ASEAN's founding document, the 1967 Bangkok Declaration, made its purpose crystal clear. It pledged to promote regional peace and stability through abiding respect for justice and the rule of law and adherence to principles of the United Nations Charter. So from that, and through the key platforms such as the ASEAN Regional Forum, the East Asia Summit, and the ADMM+, ASEAN has developed a distinctive approach, one that prizes dialogue over coercion, consensus over confrontation, and non-interference over intervention. And this has become known as the ASEAN way. And sometimes it's easy, I think, to dismiss this approach as endless talking or bureaucratic caution. Yep, sorry, are you... Is everything okay?
Okay, sorry, any for our friends, please the family to mute the participant in
I'm sorry, is there a question? I can't quite hear.
No problem. It's no question. It's please continue your first question.
Okay. Okay, I'll continue. So it's, as I was saying, some people, we know, I think it might be, perhaps somebody else is, I'm just hearing some talking, that's all.
I'm sorry, Rob, please continue your first question.
Okay, I'll continue. So there are critics of the ASEAN way, but when you talk to ASEAN diplomats, the never-ending nature of the talking is the point. That is a very important part of ASEAN's process, and dialogue has been ASEAN's most consistent tool of conflict prevention. So building habits of consultation and of dialogue have made interstate war among ASEAN members virtually unthinkable. So there are some persisting territorial disputes. Earlier this year, for example, we saw Thai and Cambodia border. Obviously, there are inter-ASEAN disputes around the South China Sea, but ASEAN has succeeded in preventing major wars in Southeast Asia for nearly 6 decades. And I think we need to acknowledge and appreciate that achievement. So the ASEAN Charter, adopted in 2007, reaffirmed this peace-first philosophy. It commits members to maintaining and enhancing peace, security and stability, and to rely on peaceful settlements of disputes. These principles were first codified in the 1976 Treaty of Amity and Cooperation, which established a legally binding code for interstate relations based on non-aggression and peaceful coexistence. The TAC now has 55 signatories that extends well beyond the Southeast Asian countries, including my own country of Australia, which joined in 2005. So ASEAN's vision for conflict prevention has never been inward-looking. It has been inclusive and it has been outward-facing, designed to shape a broader regional architecture, which is why we see these ASEAN-centred mechanisms that are broader than Southeast Asia. And we also see ASEAN's 2019 outlook on the Indo-Pacific, which reiterated ASEAN's determination to promote an enabling environment for peace, stability and prosperity through dialogue and cooperation. Now, some might see this as a bit idealistic in an era of growing militarization, but another reading is that ASEAN is doubling down on its founding purpose, preserving regional stability through engagement and neutrality, even as others push for alignment or confrontation. So ASEAN has placed itself at the heart of wider regional diplomacy, creating institutions that give it both convening power and legitimacy. So the ARF, for example, was established in 1994 and is supported by senior officials and working groups and remains the most explicit multilateral mechanism for conflict prevention in the region. So its founding concept called for 3 stages: confidence building measures, preventive diplomacy, and eventually conflict resolution mechanisms. The East Asia Summit, established in 2005, brings together leaders from across the Indo-Pacific. That includes China and the United States and Japan, India and Russia. And there is also defence cooperation that is deepened through the ADM Plus, established in 2010. So these ASEAN-centred mechanisms bring ASEAN and key partners together to enhance regional peace through practical cooperation. And it's not just about military conflict and preventing military conflict, but it's also through grappling with things like humanitarian assistance to maritime security, which we're going to hear more about from the next speaker, I'm sure, and counter-terrorism. So all of these forums are voluntary, they're consensus-based, and they're non-coercive. Their strength lies in building trust over time. And it's not as if they don't have weaknesses. Of course, they rely on goodwill with no enforcement and no monitoring capacity. And that is an area where there are, I think, limitations in what ASEAN can do, because it can leave ASEAN struggling to keep pace. If I can have the next slide, thanks. So there is a sense of, back to the ASEAN, back to the previous slide, if I may. The slide before, sorry, if we can go back to, it should say ASEAN paradox.
Next.
Senta. Yes,
The,
very
the,
close.
the slide before? Perfect. Thank you. So there is a sort of ASEAN paradox that has emerged out of all of this, which is that using ASEAN preventative diplomacy mechanisms risks losing those mechanisms. So there's a hesitance in ASEAN to use the preventive diplomacy mechanisms that have been created. So one of the questions that we have is what space is there to push the boundaries within ASEAN on consensus in order to recenter the importance of conflict prevention? And also we have a question about what role can non-ASEAN states and non-great powers such as Australia or India or Japan play in promoting preventive diplomacy in and beyond the ASEAN-centred architecture. Now, I was going to talk a little bit more about the South China Sea as a particular area of concern. This is, something that a lot of countries are focused on. It's certainly an area, a key issue for ASEAN, because there are countries that have different views on the South China Sea. And it's also important to think about it because the Indo-Pacific is a maritime region, and any future conflict would likely begin at sea. And we don't want to see miscalculation occurring at sea or in the airspace above it. One wrong maneuver, one collision might potentially trigger escalation. But I'm going to leave that to one side because we will be, as I said before, no doubt hearing more about maritime security later. So if we move to the next slide, I just want to look ahead for this final section of my presentation. It's important to remember that ASEAN's brand of conflict prevention is not only multilateral, there is scope for unilateral and minilateral peace initiatives as well. And countries like Vietnam, Singapore, and Indonesia have all shown initiatives in hosting or facilitating sensitive talks. We can think of the Trump-Kim summit, for example, during the first Trump administration. There are cross-strait meetings, and they have held regional dialogues on defence and stability, including at a Track 1, Track 1.5 and Track 2 level with Australia, Indonesia, Malaysia and Australia on this very issue of conflict prevention. So looking ahead, a new generation of ASEAN leaders will face the dual test of revitalising ASEAN's conflict prevention mechanisms and ensuring that they remain relevant in an Indo-Pacific era that is defined by competition and confrontation, but also increased connectivity. So our analysis turns to this central question of what practical options are there for countries in the region to help prevent conflict in our region, especially through ASEAN-centred institutions. So the risk of miscalculation and confrontation are rising, and while deterrence and defence and preparedness are essential, it's not enough. What urgently is needed is diplomacy that works alongside deterrence, diplomacy that has a preventive purpose. So we focus on diplomacy as an instrument of conflict prevention. It needs to operate within what we call an ecosystem of stabilising statecraft, which has many parts. Deterrence is one, interdependence, rules, institutions, communication, and political will are all important parts of this ecosystem of stabilising statecraft. So if I can go to the next slide. So part of what regional states are really needing to do is work with the grain of ASEAN-centred mechanisms. These bodies alone cannot compel or punish, but they can promote transparency and communication, and they can institutionalize things like crisis communication mechanisms, which are the foundations of prevention. This includes identifying and monitoring risks, sharing information and early warnings, encouraging transparency in military operations and maritime conduct, and countering disinformation that can inflame crises. These bodies, ASEAN-centred mechanisms, can also broaden participation, bringing in, for example, the private sector into the conversation. Conflict would devastate regional economies. Shipping lanes, insurers, banks, energy firms, they all have a stake in stability. So creating structured dialogues between governments and business could also make the cost of conflict far more visible and prevention more compelling. But my colleagues, Rory and Wong and I, have really 4 key recommendations, a summary of practical options for Australia and for other countries in the region. First, there is a need to intensify advocacy for conflict prevention across ASEAN-centred mechanisms. And this, for a country like Australia, and I would suggest India and Japan or Korea or other non-Southeast Asian countries, this advocacy should be done in partnership with one or more ASEAN countries such as Indonesia or Singapore. Second, there is a need to support ASEAN in creating a conflict prevention unit within its secretariat. So with expertise drawn from intelligence, defence and research communities to promote transparency, reassurance and adherence to maritime rules of engagement. So we've coupled this in with establishing an information fusion centre for risk reduction and early warning. So this could aggregate open source and national data, build a repository of regional risk indicators and serve as a resource for preventing crisis, but also to be used during crises. We also have an idea of convening a regional dialogue on geopolitical resilience involving governments, business and civil society to model things like the humanitarian and economic costs of conflict and to strengthen shared awareness of what is at stake. And finally, we think that there is an opportunity to leverage the upcoming ASEAN chair sequence, Malaysia, the Philippines and Singapore, and to work alongside countries, Australia, Japan, India, Indonesia, to create a small but active conflict prevention core group. And these mechanisms should exist to reinforce deterrence rather than weakening it, making conflict not only unthinkable, but also unprofitable. So in the end, preventing conflict is not about optimism or naivety, it's about agency, the belief that diplomacy, intelligently and persistently applied, can still make a difference in our world. Now, no one country can prevent conflict alone, but by working regionally and trying to utilise the existing set of regional mechanisms, the ASEAN-centred mechanisms, we can all try to build a region where peace is sustained, and that is through design. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Your insightful presentation, Prof. Beck. And I think in your last presentation have a question. There is 2 questions, right?
On the slides?
Yeah, on the slide.
We don't really need to get to that part of the slide. I think we can discuss that maybe in the Q&A.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. I will resume the presentation from Prof. Beck. Thank you very much again, Prof. Beck, for such an insightful and new perspective in your presentation. You have clearly demonstrated how the Indo-Pacific is becoming a complex strategic space for conflict prevention. Where the risk of interstate conflict is increasing in how creative statecraft and preventing diplomacy through confidence building, transparency, and early warning mechanism are essential to reduce miscalculation and escalation. I find your point about reforming deterrence as a stabilizing rather than competitive tool particularly relevant for today's regional dynamic. And Professor Beck's presentation remind us that conflict prevention in Indo-Pacific is not only about managing crisis, but also about sustaining trust, communication, and institutional resilience among states. And her reflection on the importance of creative statecraft and the Asian paradox highlight how diplomacy must adapt to the region grounding complexity. This insightful provide a strong foundation for us to think about how regional actors, including Indonesia and Australia, can strengthen preventive diplomacy together. And before that, now we are moving to India from Australia with another distinguished voice in maritime affairs. Okay, our next speaker is Captain Kamlesh Kumar Agnihotri, retired, who is currently serving as a senior fellow at the National Maritime Foundation, India, primary think tank affiliated with the Indian Navy. Uh, Captain Kamlesh, before rejoining NMF, Captain Kamlesh was a senior fellow at the Center for Joint Warfare Studies in New Delhi, where he served until his retirement from active naval duty in 2021. His specialty field of work for last 70 years has been of Chinese Navy, Chinese Defense Force, particularly the Chinese Navy, as well as Chinese maritime in high technology development, India-China relation, and security dynamic in the Indian Ocean and the wider Indo-Pacific region. And Captain Kamlesh has presented his research internationally. Professionally, he is a naval missiles and gunner specialist with command experience in the Andaman and Nicobar Island, and also trained in remote sensing. His research are in Chinese maritime issue, India ocean maritime matters, and complex dynamics in the broader Indo-Pacific region. He is a key interlocutor during institutional interaction with foreign think tank, the Center of Naval Analysis in Washington, Naval War College, Newport RSIS Singapore, and being some of them. Okay, please welcoming our second speakers today, Captain Kamlesh Kumar Agnihotri. And Captain Kamlesh, you wanna share screen or help by our committee?
No, I do not have a presentation. I will, since the subject was keynote address, so I
Okay,
decided to address the gathering.
okay. Please, our committee. Oh, sorry. We have preparing your material to slide presentation before it. Okay, please welcome Captain Kamlesh. The floor and the screen are yours.
Uh, Thank you, moderator, and thank you for the Sunan Ampel universities, particularly the Department of Political Science, for giving me this opportunity to address the students and faculty during this conference on a very topical subject of navigating conflict. I'm particularly picking up the word of navigating conflict because that is what Professor Rebecca alluded to, and she gave a very detailed theoretical underpinning of the subject. I will be a little more direct. Being a military person, I'll be a little more direct in my intervention. And of course, the subject is such that there will be certain commonalities, and I will point out the commonalities between what Professor Rebecca said and what I would be saying as we go along. So, I will present an Indian perspective on maritime security challenges in the Western Pacific Ocean and offer certain recommendations as regards how can all the stakeholders collectively work towards mitigating such challenges. As we all know, the vast Indo-Pacific region, extending from the west coast of United States to the east coast of Africa and forming about two-thirds of the Earth's surface, is beset with a variety of geographical contestations, simmering tensions, underlying fault lines, and consequent potential for conflict and instability. The vast region can be further divided into two somewhat clear segments: the Pacific Ocean and the Indian Ocean. It is generally observed that the security challenges that threaten the freedom, openness, and stability in the Indo Pacific region mainly arise from the whole of Western Pacific littoral, ranging from Russia's east coast to Korean peninsula, encompassing all of Japanese islands and covering the entire East and South China Seas. The contentious territorial sovereignty disputes and overlapping maritime claims between various state actors, including Russia, Japan, China, North Korea, South Korea, Taiwan, Philippines, and Vietnam, lie at the root of this tenuous regional situation. My address at this very important conference offers an overview of the prevailing contemporary geopolitical environment in the Western Pacific littoral with specific focus on the fragile maritime security situation arising out of the proactive actions taken by various involved state parties to enforce their rigid stances and safeguard their perceived maritime rights and interests. Firstly, I draw your attention to the situation in the East China Sea, where the conflicting claims over the territorial sovereignty and maritime rights between Japan and China have become an area, a hotbed of military posturing. Secondly, the whole of international strategic community has been watching the existent volatile situation in and around the Taiwan Strait with great concern, where the acts of Chinese military coercion are casting an ominous shadow of confrontation. Thirdly, I'll briefly discuss the multi pronged games of brinkmanship being played out in the South China Sea, as Professor Rebecca mentioned, where aggressive moves by China to unilaterally create a new normal by continuous use of grey zone tactics are clearly apparent to everyone. Fourthly, I will allude to the lessons that the global strategic community, including India, must draw from the prevalent situation in the Indo Pacific and the options that the country can exercise towards furtherance of Indian maritime interests. I will finally conclude by making a mention of the valuable bilateral relations that India and Indonesia share and how that can add great value to safeguarding the mutual national security interests, including those in the maritime domain. So, coming back to the East China Sea, which is actually a hotbed of military posturing, as I like to call it. China and Japan have largely shared an antagonistic relationship for quite a long time, having fought many wars, particularly over last 2 centuries. Japan also invaded China a number of times and captured many islands, including Taiwan, during this period. In the contemporary time, the territorial disputes over Senkaku Islands, which continue to remain under administrative control of Japan, and the claim over their associated maritime zones is a matter of great discord between the two countries. After Japan decided to nationalize the three small islands of Senkakus in 2012, the Chinese Coast Guard ships and other maritime administration vessels started getting deployed on a regular basis in support of Chinese claims. These ships have been operating in contiguous zone of the Senkakus in large numbers on an almost everyday basis and have often been crossing over into their territorial seas also. In addition, the Chinese military aircraft regularly operate in the maritime areas surrounding the Senkaku Islands and fly close to these Japanese islands. Further, over the last decade plus, overtly aggressive activities by the Chinese PLA, mainly the PLA Navy and the PLA Air Force, in the maritime vicinity of the Japanese islands, that is the main islands, have seen an incremental rise. These include two-way transit of Chinese warships and overflight of PLA Air Force aircraft through various straits separating these main Japanese islands. Chinese submarines have also been known to operate in the surrounding Japanese waters, with one precarious incident involving the submerged passage of a nuclear submarine through the Japanese territorial waters. The Chinese and Russian navies have been conducting bilateral exercises since last 5 years with ever increasing frequency and scale at various locations around Japan, including in the Sea of Japan. However, if the inordinately aggressive Chinese posturing crosses certain national security red lines unacceptable to Japan, and given the fact that Japanese naval and aerial hardware in some cases is qualitatively superior, and as we all know, Tokyo enjoys a firm military security guarantee from Washington as its closest ally. So, in that case, the probability of a bloody Japanese and Chinese military confrontation occurring in future cannot be ruled out. Now, a few words about the very tenuous Taiwan Strait situation. Security situation across Taiwan Strait has been precariously poised, particularly since the visit of Ms. Nancy Pelosi, Speaker of the US House of Representatives, in August of 2022. The PLA Navy since then has begun to openly engage in increased deployment and maneuvers in the Taiwan Strait, as also of the eastern coast of Taiwan. The PLA Air Force aircraft and drones now fly across the median line and on an almost daily basis, and intrude into the Taiwan's air defense identification zone at will. The occasion-specific PLA deployments and exercises also provide an unambiguous indicator of Chinese intent. Within 3 days of Taiwan's new president assuming office on 20th May 2024, the Chinese PLA conducted a well-publicized exercise called Joint Sword 2024A all around Taiwan. This multi-domain exercise involved the PLA Navy ships and submarines, PLA Air Force aircraft, PLA Army's amphibious troops, PLA rocket force units, and even the Chinese Coast Guard ships for the first time. The exercise was spread over many areas around Taiwan and also brought the outlying islands of Kinmen, Matsu, Uchiyo, and Tonkin into its ambit. The blatant display of scaremongering was similarly repeated just 4 days after the Taiwanese president's first National Day speech. That was in October, on 10th October of 2024, and the exercise took place on 14th October. The exercise was named Joint Sword 2024B, and it was held in locations which were even closer to Taiwan. This included the participation of the Liaoning Aircraft Carrier Group also. The subsequent exercise this year, ominously named as Straits Thunder 2025A, on the 1st and 2nd April this year, was of even greater scale and intensity. Now, what we see is that the progressive increase in the tempo of Chinese military exercises, when read in combination with the Chinese reunification agenda as articulated in its white paper on Taiwan, that was articulated in August 2022. It should leave no one in any doubt about the possibility of this horrific event occurring much sooner than anticipated. In fact, the global media speculation, duly fueled by the occasional statements of senior US military officials, has already posted a possible timeline of 2027 for this event. Though the Chinese president, vehemently denies it, but then we know the Chinese propensity for surprising the world. And now the South China Sea issue, and I term it as a playground of brinkmanship. Now, China staked its, you people already are well aware of the dynamics. However, I'll just reiterate that China staked its maritime claim to nearly 90% of the South China Sea by publicly asserting in a note to the United Nations Commission on the limits of the continental shelf, that is UNCLCS, in May of 2009, that it enjoyed sovereign rights and jurisdiction over the islands in the South China Sea and the adjacent waters, as well as seabed and subsoil thereof. Now, it sought legitimacy for this expansive, legally untenable claim by attaching the 9-dash line map to the note. The proactive Chinese activities in support of their so called maritime rights and interests in the South China Sea have particularly seen the adoption of aggressive stance against the Philippines. The Chinese fishing fleet, maritime militia vessels, coast guard ships, using various combinations of grey zone tactics, have been constantly blocking the access of the Philippines naval ships and government vessels to various islands and features within the EZ of Philippines. They have also been systematically harassing the Filipino fishermen and disrupting their fishing activities. The prime areas of repeated China-Philippines standoff in the South China Sea, particularly since heightening of the bilateral tensions in 2012, are the Scarborough Shoal, Second Thomas Shoal, and the Sabina Shoal. We have also seen soft collision and harassment of Philippines government vessels off Titu Island just this month. So even though the International Court of Arbitration at The Hague passed a ruling in favor of Philippines in 2016, rendering all the maritime areas in the South China Sea encompassed by the so-called 9-dash line as contrary to the United Nations Convention of Law of the Seas and without lawful effect. Further, the Hague Tribunal said that China had violated the sovereign rights of Philippines over various features within that country's EZ. But Beijing simply refuses to accept the award on certain spacious technical grounds. In fact, the ASEAN countries, having sensed the unilateral and revisionist tendencies of China, soon after their use of force against Vietnam and Philippines in the 80s and 90s, managed to collectively negotiate a declaration on the conduct of parties in the South China Sea, in short, the DOC, in 2002. However, the non-binding nature of the DOC turned out to be its biggest drawback, as China continues to override its provisions to suit its interests, while holding a facade of collaborative pretense. The ineffectiveness of DOC in checking the Chinese salami slicing tactics in the South China Sea led to another concerted effort by the ASEAN bloc to negotiate a fresh code of conduct, in short, the COC, with China. However, while the COC negotiations continue to languish for more than a decade, China purposefully goes about pursuing its revisionist agenda. The net result of all this wrangling is that ASEAN stands quite fragmented over the South China Sea issue. China, of course, stands to benefit from this divided ASEAN house, and Beijing refers to or prefers to rather deal bilaterally with each of these countries with a view to arrive at a negotiated settlement in favor of its own national interest by leveraging the vast differential between their comprehensive national strengths. It is thus quite possible that China in near future may take unilaterally aggressive actions to change the status quo in South China Sea by forcefully grabbing certain disputed features through the use of its grey zone warfare assets and tactics. The foremost country that may face the brunt of Chinese use of force is the Philippines. And the first domino to fall could be the Second Thomas Shoal. Beijing is possibly playing a waiting game vis-a-vis the Sierra Madre landing ship of the Philippines Navy, which has remained aground for close to 3 decades on Second Thomas Shoal. Maybe it is patiently waiting for the highly corroded ship to sink of its own accord before making any further moves. The second plausible target could be the Scarborough Shoal, where the Chinese maritime militia vessels, fishing fleet, and Chinese Coast Guard ships, often working in unison, have been systematically denying access to Filipino fishermen, government vessels, Coast Guard ships, and naval ships. China also promulgated fresh baselines around the shoal in November last year in order to provide legal sanctity to its access control gambit and sought to cement its claim by submitting their coordinates to the United Nations a month later. The tensions in this area actually went through the roof, if I can call it that, in August this year, when a PLA Navy ship and a Chinese Coast Guard ship collided with each other while undertaking a high speed chase of the Philippines Coast Guard and fisheries vessels. This was a very highly publicized incident, and we can see that the tension between China and Philippines has been only on the rise post this incident of August. Since the Philippines and US are treaty allies, the US Department of Defense, now of course they call it US Department of War, has been actively supporting Manila's capacity building and capability enhancement efforts. In addition, the US Navy has increased its proactive presence in the South China Sea, often deploying 2 aircraft carrier groups in tandem. Japan has committed to support the Philippines through sale of large Coast Guard vessels and by offering soft loans and grants for building of more ships for the Philippines Coast Guard. The resultant situation arising out of the confrontational big power dynamics, overlapping territorial sovereignty, and maritime zone claims, and related national sensitivities of the disputants is quite volatile. Therefore, the acts of brinkmanship, whether by use of grey zone tactics or by way of overt posturing that imply the threat of use of force, certainly have the potential to escalate into an open conflict with terrible consequences foreseen for all concerned. So, what are the lessons to learn from this particular area where large scale instability just below the surface remains? The foremost lesson that the global policymakers must derive from the emergent situation in the Western Pacific is that the current rules based and time tested global order must be preserved at all costs so as to prevent the possibility of an altered balance of power in favor of states with known revisionist agenda. However, it is more than apparent that China, with its propensity to always create a new normal in the Western Pacific Ocean and elsewhere, as is its wont, is not quite amenable to the dialogue and discussions within the tenets of the existing global order, based on international conventions, treaties, customary laws, and rules framed by various global governing institutions. So, another option available to global community is dissuasion through multi-pronged opposition to revisionist mindset and activities and collective effort at disapproval, condemnation, and isolation. I am only paraphrasing what Professor Rebecca talked about prevention and deterrence. So this is all part of the preventive diplomacy. It is just that being in military, I have talked in terms of disapproval, condemnation, and isolation. This effort, however, requires a strong united front to be presented by a large group of countries. However, that is very hard to accomplish in the contemporary global landscape, with states persisting with different viewpoints, priorities, IR compulsions, and above all, widely varying national interests. The resultant absence of robust unified mechanisms to mount sufficient pressure on the challenger to conform to the provisions of the established rules based global order may render such initiatives as largely ineffective and thus cause them to fall well short of the desired outcome. That leaves only one option, and that of deterrence. Again, I would refer to the concept of deterrence provided by Professor Rebecca. Now, this is well nigh impossible to exercise for any one country on its own. She also said that. However powerful and capable and resource rich a country may be, it is not possible for one country to do that. So, this again calls for great degree of collaborative effort, sincerity of purpose, and commitment of large quantum of financial, technological, and human resources over longer term. In order for this gambit to succeed, the countries which actually stand to be most adversely affected must take a concerted decision to develop punitive capabilities to retaliate in the all encompassing realm of multi domain warfare. Now, Professor Rebecca said that the warfare and, and conflict is only one part of the deterrence initiative, but I would like to highlight that this is an important and a very vital part of the deterrence initiative, particularly when it is done in a combined manner with sincerity of purpose and undertaken by a large group of countries. However, this appears to be an even taller order than the concept of collaborative dissuasion. But if the world truly understands the perils, and I choose my words carefully, if the world truly understands the perils of living in a China centric global order, then there is no option but to give this deterrence option an honest trial. Now, being an Indian, I would like to offer some response options for India, of course. The dynamically fluid geopolitical environment in the Western Pacific, on account of intractable stances and not negotiable positions adopted by certain countries, leaves very little maneuvering room for external players. Though India does not have a direct connect with the region per se, of course, with Indo-Pacific term coming into greater salience, I can say with certain confidence that, of course, it is a direct connect. The very fact that a large portion of India's secondary areas of maritime interest lie in that region makes it imperative for the country to carefully weigh its options and response plans. The Western Pacific region also qualifies as India's secondary area of interest on yet another parameter, that is based on considerations of Indian diaspora, overseas investments, and political relations. Since these factors form an intrinsic part of India's national interest in the Western Pacific, New Delhi has no choice but to respond to the current developments in the region with measured correctness. However, it would be quite unrealistic for India to intervene militarily at such extended distances. Therefore, other levers of the DIME construct, we all know DIME, the diplomatic, informational, military, and economic, must be suitably exercised, either in standalone mode or in various combinations. I now refer to some specific measures that India can take. India can ensure that Taiwan continues to exist as an independent nation, free from overt threats of reunification, so that it continues to occupy the front side focus of China. To facilitate this endeavor, India must give serious thought to progressively extending the growing economic and people to people relations with Taiwan into diplomatic realm also, by maybe finding finer nuances to its one China policy. Of course, this is my view, and it is not the view of any government body in India or the National Maritime Foundation. Secondly, it should build additional capabilities to mount effective countermeasures in the Indian Ocean, while steadfastly refusing to let China change their status quo on the land border. In fact, a heightened level of Indian naval posturing in the Indian Ocean may be demonstrated to coincide with specific developments when excessive Chinese brinkmanship in the East China Sea, Taiwan Strait, or South China Sea is observed. India may either increase the frequency of its annual overseas deployments in the Western Pacific or extend their duration, and also provide greater publicity of these events in the international print, visual, and social media. India must oppose any attempts by China to unilaterally change the status quo in the East China Sea and South China Sea with regard to its expansive claims over various features and excessive maritime claims in as many forums as possible. And Professor Rebecca has alluded to ASEAN being central, ASEAN and its various conferences and forums being central to such an objective. Finally, India must advocate the necessity of keeping PLA busy on the multiple fronts from different directions. And the members of Quad grouping can play a very active part in this effort. Japan could deploy more of its JMSDF, Coast Guard, and Air Force assets off Senkaku Islands, and also to actively shadow the PLA warships and aircraft crossing various straits under its jurisdiction. An increase in the freedom of navigation operations in Taiwan Strait and around the Chinese claimed features in the Paracel and Spratly Islands by the US Navy ships will also ensure the engagement of sizable PLA forces in the area. As far as Australia is concerned, the recent positive developments in the AUKUS should also keep the Chinese military strategic focus on that particular area. Though, of course, it is a long time, I would say a long time gestation project and may fructify somewhere around 2035 to 2040. Now, I will start my conclusion by again highlighting the inherently unstable maritime security environment in the Indo-Pacific, which is driven by complicated geopolitical dynamics between regional littoral states. This naturally presents a huge area of concern for the largely interconnected world. The majority of global commodity and energy, and particularly trade, moving across the international sea lanes, forms the economic lifeline of almost all countries. Therefore, it is in the utmost interest of all stakeholders to ensure that the seaborne connectivity through the Pacific Ocean is not interrupted on account of serious instability that is taking root in the region. Given the fact that this imperative holds true for India also, the country has a maritime power of some consequence, and having a vital stake in the free flow of trade through the region must also take suitable measures to provide for slot security. In fact, the inherent instability in the Western Pacific must be viewed as an opportunity for India to lend more intensity and heft to its Act East policy by proactively leveraging its good relations with countries like Russia, Japan, South Korea, Philippines, Vietnam, and above all, Indonesia. In this context, I will close my address by highlighting the ways in which our longtime friend Indonesia can contribute to India's maritime security and well-being. Strategically, Indonesia and India share a maritime border with the province of Aceh, that is the Sabang Island, being separated from the southernmost tip of India by less than 100 nautical miles, to be precise, 95 nautical miles. With the contemporary geopolitical center of gravity shifting from west to the east, the littorals of the Indo-Pacific region have become increasingly alarmed about the security, and that very much includes the Indian Ocean littorals also. Therefore, it is crucial for them to collaborate in addressing these concerns. Indonesia has referred to itself as the global maritime fulcrum in the Indo-Pacific, which is a phrase that former President Joko Widodo stated in his election manifesto. The global maritime fulcrum's overarching goal is to make Indonesia a maritime power in the Indo-Pacific. Geographically, the Indonesian archipelago extends from the Andaman Sea's tip to the South China Sea via the Strait of Malacca, and from there it passes by the Java and the Banda Sea to the Pacific Ocean. Thus, the Indonesian archipelago is a key component of global shipping, as it covers some of the most strategically significant choke points, including Strait of Malacca, Sunda, Lombok, and Makassar. These straits also serve as the ports of entry and exit for the Indian Ocean. A significant route between the Pacific and Indian Oceans is the Strait of Malacca, and India depends heavily on the Strait of Malacca for 40% of its imports, making it a strategically vital artery and, by implication, Indonesia as a most valuable partner. The Indonesian and Indian navies signed their first security agreement in the 1958, and since then the their navy fleets have been participating in the joint naval exercises, and this affair has become quite regular. An Indonesian warship is actually participating in a bilateral exercise off Vishakhapatnam on India's east coast now as I speak here. Both the Indonesian and Indian navies have conducted coordinated maritime patrols at their shared maritime border in the Andaman Sea, which is located at the northern entrance of the Strait of Malacca, also known as the 6-degree channel. Additionally, Indonesia takes part in the Indian Ocean Naval Symposium and the multilateral naval exercises coordinated by India, including the search and rescue exercises and the Milan series of exercises. Now, final words, these are aspirational words, and these are the closing statements of mine with an aspirational hope that our bilateral relations will increase further if these activities, as I say here, are taken into account. So, what are these? Internationally operating warships and submarines must pass through one of the straits that Indonesia controls. Owing to the strait's relative narrowness and shallow depth, Indonesia is quite well placed to monitor ship and submarine passages. Hence, India sees a great deal of potential for future collaboration with Indonesia in this area, particularly with regard to the warships and submarines from certain countries that cross the Indonesian straits and enter the Indian Ocean. Needless to say, the underwater domain awareness will greatly improve if some subaquatic sensors can be installed below these straits on the seabed by Indonesia, and by some kind of an agreement, the data so collected by Indonesia is shared by India. So this is what is the final word that I would like to close my address with. I wish the organizers of the conference a very, very successful conference and a day of deliberations. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Captain Kamlesh. Okay, Captain Kamlesh, I will resume your explain. Thank you for interesting and comprehensive explanation. Both of our speakers today truly complement each other, giving us with of Indo-Pacific perspective from Australia and India. Captain Kamlesh underscores that Indonesia occupies central strategic position in Indo-Pacific, serving as the geographic and political. The first, our prepared PowerPoint have a title line spin in bahasa, meaning elemen penting yang menyatukan sesuatu yang kompleks dan cukup rapuh. And the situation in the South China Sea has become increasingly complex, with China assertive action as a major power, often violating international norms without facing effective legal consequence. This escalation underscores the importance of cooperation among littoral states, particularly through strengthened coordinates between their Coast Guard and maritime law enforcement agencies. Broader global dialogue is urgently needed to address these challenges and uphold a stable maritime order in the region. To prevent further tensions, the region must pursue a balanced approach that combines prevention, deterrence, and resilience building, strengthening commitment to maritime security, human security, technology innovation, and economic stability will be essential for maintaining long-term regional peace. A collective and rule-based response grounded in mutual trust and shared responsibility remains the cornerstone for ensuring that the South China Sea remains a zone of peace and cooperation. And then Captain Kamlesh highlight Indonesia's strategic position, commanding major choke points such as Malacca, Sunda, Lombok, and Makassar Strait, place it at the very center of this geopolitical landscape. And Indonesia vision as a global maritime fulcrum is therefore not only symbolic but essential to maintaining open and secure sea lanes by reinforcing deterrence, prevention, and resilience through cooperation and in technology, human security, and of course, economic stability. Indonesia and its partner can shape a more balanced and sustainable in Indo-Pacific order. Thank you again, Captain Agnihotri and Professor Rebecca. Now we will open the floor for discussion. If you are joining on site, please raise your hand and I will call on you. And please come forward to the microphone and ask question one by one. And for online participant, please type your question in the Zoom chat or use raise hand feature to ask the speakers directly. Maybe in chat box, our technical team will help coordinate if any question in the chat box in the Zoom. Oh, there is no question. Okay, I will open a question for this place. Please raise your hand if you have any question. Okay, 1, 2, 3. Again. Okay, first round, 3 person. Please come to microphone one by one. The first, please. Okay. Okay, let's go.
Okay, excuse me. My name is Yusuf Aditya. I'm from International Relations Program Study. So I've got 2 questions for Professor Rebecca. First is about the effectiveness of preventive diplomacy. I think the traditional one. So as we know, in this globalized world, the actor in the international arena is not just state actor. My concern is on the conflict preventions. As you mentioned before, the preventive diplomacy is include some building confidence and trust between the actors. But if we look the conflict nowadays in the international arena, maybe Russian invasion in Ukraine, Russia did not just use military aspect in launch their attack in Ukraine. They also use a cyberware attack. They do include a hacker group, a criminal group, to launch a cyber attack to Ukraine. So my question is, if this such a hacker group is exists in conflict, how do we prevent it? Because in preventive diplomacy, in the sub actions like CBM, confidence building measure, it just include state actor. While in the conflict, it's not just the state actor. There's so many non-state actor, especially the transnational criminal group. That's the first question. And then the second is refers to your questions in your slide of presentations about how is the military deterrence as conflict preventions. You asked that how can we measure the conflict, the military deterrence as conflict preventions is not end up being arm racing. So I think that's that what actually happen now in the world, especially in a symmetry relationship conflict like US and Russia. They are two big countries, so it is symmetry conflict, and it if include military deterrence, it can be end up as racing. But my question is also, if we look on asymmetry conflict relations, let's see in the South China Sea. China is a big country, while the ASEAN countries is, it's developed countries. So I think it's not gonna go a better way also as like the symmetry one, because I think the bigger countries like China is tend to be focused on their interests. They will get as much as they can in the conflict. I think countries like China in the South China Sea dispute will not pay a great attention in confidence building measures. So my question is how we can figure it out. That's it. Thank you.
I think that the first question for Professor Beck.
Yes, I'm happy to address those two questions now, and thank you very much for the considered questions. I might start with the last point first, because this is a real challenge when thinking about using ASEAN-centered mechanisms in order to try to prevent great power conflict. The problem is actually with the great powers. It is a limitation with, thinking about how to do diplomacy, because it does rely on a country like China to have their own thinking about conflict prevention. And I suspect that in Beijing, the thinking around conflict prevention in something like the South China Sea is simply that everybody else should not come near the maritime areas that it claims, which is not a very good solution when it comes to understanding international law of the sea or the claims of Southeast Asian countries. So I'm very sympathetic to the viewpoint that preventing conflict actually requires the bigger powers, the political will of bigger powers to not get involved in conflict. And that is part of the point that that we make in the paper, is that the economic costs of, say, a Taiwan contingency are as significant to China as other countries. And I think we need to keep reinforcing what the costs of conflict are, not just to smaller and middle powers in the region, but to the great powers as well. In terms, and partly this is about what can regional countries do to try to bind China and other countries to socialize them into understanding that conflict is not a desirable mechanism for achieving national interests. In terms of arms racing and the security spiral, this is I think identifies one of my key concerns with deterrence as a framework, and I would love to hear the captain's view on this as well. Deterrence needs to be coupled with reassurance, and I think that's more relevant for bigger powers than it is for smaller powers, because there is such a massive gap in capabilities, especially if you're looking between China and Southeast Asian militaries. And so partly deterrence, I think, is about smaller countries being able to sort of prevent intervention. So what we might call in the Taiwan context a porcupine strategy, which can actually draw upon asymmetry as a way of preventing attack, preventing invasion. We call it in Australia an echidna strategy. It's raising the cost, I think, of intervention. And that's what smaller and middle powers need to do. And it does increase the risk of a security spiral and arm racing, but that's why reassurance is really important. And I'm going to give you an example here, because I know that the AUKUS agreement has caused concerns in Indonesia and in other countries in Southeast Asia and the Pacific, particularly when it was first announced and there wasn't a lot of explanation about AUKUS, the trilateral partnership between Australia, the United States and the United Kingdom, which is designed, at least in part, to deliver nuclear-powered submarines to Australia. And concerns around arm racing have been expressed in the region that AUKUS will contribute to this arms racing. Australia would say, well, China has been contributing to the arms racing, and that's kind of why Australia need nuclear-powered submarines. But the problem with the original announcement of AUKUS is that Australia didn't really do a very good job of explaining that it's not seeking to, threaten any other country's national interest. It's just trying to protect its own national interest and trying to increase its own defence capability. And that's what reinsurance is really all about. And so over the last 2 or 3 years, the Australian government has been really active in trying to reassure people in the region that AUKUS is not about, Australia building up its own capability to create harm to other countries in the region, but it is part of that deterrence both at home, but also the regional or the collective deterrence that the captain was talking about, and wanting to contribute to preventing unilateral changes to the status quo. And so that's a lesson there, that deterrence, it's military, building up military capabilities is important for smaller and middle power countries facing threats from much bigger powers, but it does need to be accompanied with diplomatic overtures around what the purpose of this military build-up is in order to try to reduce tension and reduce that sense of a security spiral. In terms of the first question around, it's not just military, but it's cyber, and it's certainly other forms of coercion as well that we can think of. That is absolutely true. Although I would also argue that in our region, if we're talking about something like the South China Sea or the Taiwan Strait, a lot of the non-state actors that are involved in coercive grey zone tactics are actually really part of the state when it comes to China. So, for example, China's Coast Guard comes under the military. And so there's a really slippery definitional issue when it comes to state versus non-state actors in some of these countries that I think we probably need to recognise. But certainly in the information space, so one of the areas that I work in, which is strategic narratives, in the South China Sea, disinformation is becoming harder to counter because of the increasingly complex information environment where you have AI and deep fakes and, videos that go around that look like they are political leaders making speeches, but are in fact, they've never happened. So separating truth from fiction and being able to defend against the use of lawfare, so the abuse of international legal principles through these strategic narratives, I think is also an important part of conflict prevention as well, but also being smaller and middle powers being able to defend their entitlements. And while I didn't talk a huge amount about that, that is incredibly important when we're thinking about maritime and we're thinking about the South China Sea, and we're thinking about the politics of law of the sea, is defending rules and norms that support, the abilities of states to access their maritime entitlements.
Okay, thank you, Prof. Beck. Give applause. Okay, then we move to next participant. Have a question, please. Second participant. Okay. Ya, silakan. Okay.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Before that, let me introduce myself. I'm Kusmardani Zainuddin, but everyone can call me Mawar. Mawar. Okay, I am the international relations student at FISIP UINSA in this university. So I have, before that, thank you so much for Professor Beck Strating for your next explanation, and also for the Captain Kamlesh for your great presentation. So my questions is especially for the Professor Beck Strating. Uh, as you mentioned before about the concept of creative statecraft on your slide, on your PPT, as we know that creative statecraft emphasizes the importance of innovative diplomatic strategies to prevent conflict. So my question is, would you explain what form could creative statecraft take in practice for a middle power such as Indonesia? And my second question is especially to the Captain Kamlesh. It's about the, as you know that maritime contestation in Southeast Asia is quite massive now. So with the Strait of Malacca and the planned construction of the Kra Canal in Thailand, so my question is, what are the potential impacts on the Strait of Malacca? That's my question. Thank you so much. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you, Mawar. And I will let Captain Kamlesh for answering first before Prof. Beck. Captain Kamlesh, time's yours.
Thank you to the young lady. A very nice question, very pertinent question. My response would be that the state of Malacca and the trade passing through it is not going away in hurry anytime soon. In fact, the Malacca dilemma has been attributed to the Chinese president of that time as one of the major concerns with regard to safeguarding the Chinese transit of its trade, energy, and other commodity supply lines. So the Strait of Malacca, whether the Kra Canal has been flattering to deceive for last 15 odd years. The first some kind of a survey was done in I think 2009 and 10, and generally seeing the economics involved, huge economics involved, as well as the sensitivities of Thailand, that project has continuously being put on the back burner, and a lot of theoretical constructs have been put, theoretical propositions have been put with regard to Kra Canal coming into being again and again. But notwithstanding the theoretical propositions, my personal view is that the Kra Canal is not coming up anytime soon. And as long as Kra Canal doesn't come up anytime soon, the strategic importance of the Malacca Strait as the primary artery for promotion of global trade from east to west and west to east will continue to remain. I would rather say that Indonesia, more than the Strait of Malacca, the other two straits, the Sunda Strait as well as the Lombok Strait, should be of much more maritime security concern to the countries in the Indian Ocean as well as to the countries in the Pacific Ocean, because the heavily laden very large crude carriers and the ultra large crude carriers for one, and as I alluded to in my presentation, the Chinese ships and submarines and going to and fro are actually presenting some kind of a I would say security situation. And when I say security situation, it is in a much broader broad based way. It is the economic security situation as well as the maritime security situation, as well as the I would say national well being itself, which comes into focus. So I would rest the apprehensions of the young lady at this moment by saying that Kra Canal, notwithstanding, the effectiveness and the relevance, strategic relevance of Strait of Malacca will continue to exist. Thank you.
Thank you, Captain. And sorry, in the first question, Prof. Beck mentioned about your perspective on asymmetric in facing the Chinese South China Sea in the first question before. Please, maybe you have a perspective on your maybe experience in practical in Navy, Chinese Navy. So in the knowledge, we have a limitation about practical, but you have experience in now Chinese Navy, so maybe have a new perspective about facing the asymmetric warfare in the South China Sea. Please, Captain.
Yes, I would like to. I certainly had a view, but I defer to the question being asked to only Professor Rebecca. So I wanted her to have the first say, which she had. I have a view. The thing of the question about preventive diplomacy and the deterrence. Now, I have introduced another in between term called dissuasion. Dissuasion is something like, that the whole act cannot be prevented. And as I said, why it can't be prevented is because there is no unity of purpose. The various states are having their specific agendas, they are having their specific national interests, they are having economic dependencies of varying kind on China. And some of these economic dependencies are so large that they cannot take a overtly opposite, or I would say, I won't want to call it hostile, overtly opposite view with regard to their maritime security. In fact, the long held belief that the Southeast Asian states and indeed some states of the Indian Ocean littoral could look for economic dependencies on China, but look for military security or their national security to US. This notion is under great challenge, particularly over last decade, wherein there have been two presidencies of our favorite US president. Uh, so it is coming under increasing challenge, this notion. If this notion is coming under increasing challenge, then there is no option but to unite and provide a united face to uh, challenge the so-called expansive and hegemonistic agenda. We won't want to be living in an environment where it is controlled by one unilateral power. Deterrence, I will tell you, has some connotations. Deterrence, of course, is an even taller order, as I said in my presentation. But I would like to point out that deterrence can have a certain nuance. Now, till now, the Southeast Asian countries, none of the Southeast Asian countries have really stood up to a level where a military soldier or somebody like that can come to a harm, and they are willing to accept that harm as a normal way of standing up to the regional bully. Now, only two powers have stood up like this. One, of course, is India across its land border, and during the Galwan conflict in 2020, and that has sent a salutary message actually to China. It is a huge deterrence, but it is a huge deterrence at a cost of somebody risking his life and actually losing life. Now, a lot of song and dance was made about a Philippine soldier losing a little bit of his finger, and the Philippines president has very much gone on to say that things may escalate to a certain point where open hostilities may be there, but nobody wants to call the first shot. So, who has to call the bluff of the bully? And this nuance, of course, it is a, I would say, military nuance, wherein a person who is joining forces and is in the uniform is willing to, lay down his life, but it creates huge deterrence. If somebody stands up to that level, then the deterrence, of course, goes into a different realm. So China has stood up to it. Vietnam had earlier stood up to various powers, including to China, but that is now 50-year-old story. Now Vietnam likes to call it a bamboo diplomacy. Bamboo, like a supple plant, can swing this way or that way. Whether China uh, uh, declares fresh baselines in the Beibu Bay or the Gulf of Tonkin, as they say, and the bamboo diplomacy forces Vietnam to just be flexible in its approach. Uh, Philippines will have to stand up at certain level. The second country which has stood up to China, of course, a decade back or so during President Joko Widodo's time, is first ever incident of a Chinese fishing boat being publicly burnt. So, and that has sent a deterrence of some kind. Though the Chinese talk about Natuna seas and whole lot of other issues, and but they remain wary of the firmness of the Indonesian resolve in certain way. That is my reading from this side of Malacca Strait. It may be a little too simplistic, but I feel that if someone stands up to the bullying tactics of China in the way I have said, the way India has done, the way Indonesia has done in a nuanced way, that itself proves as some kind of a deterrence. Again, as Professor Rebecca said, I can go on and on, but I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Captain. Give applause. Okay, next we move to Professor Beck to answering the question about creative statecraft. Okay, Professor Beck, time is yours.
Sure. And thank you for the question. And I would also just say another concept that we can talk about is it's kind of a different framing, but we could also talk about resilience when it comes to being able to stand up to things like economic pressure. And there are some lessons here in terms of how Australia dealt with economic coercion from China during COVID and in the form of sanctions and tariffs, and was actually able to kind of stand up and say, we're not going to capitulate on these issues. And ultimately, both sides had to reset the relationship. So they're now in a period of stabilization. But Australia didn't really have to compromise on sovereignty issues. Yes, there was a bit of an economic hit, but ultimately all of the sanctions and the tariffs were reversed. So there are ways in which middle and smaller powers can stand up to more powerful countries. It might be in an asymmetrical military sense, but it can also be in an economic sense, which might be useful given that both the major powers are using tariffs at the moment. So there could be some lessons there for middle powers. And I would say that creative statecraft, middle powers are really instrumental and have been instrumental in exercising creative statecraft. So part of middle power diplomacy, for example, is norm entrepreneurship. And what scholars mean by norm entrepreneurship is working collectively with other countries to create norms or rules or guardrails around emerging issues. So in a maritime sense, for example, we might think about creating more norms or rules around the security of submarine cables or uncrewed vessels, or dealing with emerging issues where there may not actually be there may be a lack of clarity around international law. So middle powers have a big role to play in identifying gaps in laws and norms and governance standards internationally, and trying to fill those gaps by working collectively with other countries to reach agreement on the rules of the road, which are really important for middle powers because they don't have the military might of great powers. The second is in the area of niche areas. So middle powers, they may not have expertise or resources in kind of all areas of technology or industry or whatever, but they may have niche expertise and knowledge sharing capacities, and they may be able to work with others in particular areas, and they can show leadership in particular issue areas. And that is also a form of creative statecraft when it comes to middle powers. The third is the very important role that middle powers are playing in terms of developing strategic minilaterals. We can think of AUKUS, we could think of the Quad, we could think of the various trilateral arrangements that are increasingly important in regional international relations. Sometimes I think these are sometimes seen as just being US-led, but from my perspective, like states like India and Japan and Australia, regional and middle powers have been instrumental. And of course, ASEAN, when it was first designed, that was creative statecraft. Like we're used to ASEAN now, but somebody had to come up with that idea and people had to get behind that idea and that had to be institutionalized. So I think that the next generation is responsible for coming up with the new and creative ways of trying to increase collaboration and cooperation and to work in the preventive diplomacy space.
Thank you, Prof. Beck. Give applause, please. Okay. Next, in here, have a question. Okay, please come to microphone.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Introduce myself is Khalid Yusuf, but I known as Hans. I have a question, especially for Captain Kamlesh. I tell you about my questions. From my analysis, there is a unique phenomenon in Indonesian president history, where 3 out of 8 presidents have come from a military background. I believe this is quite a significant number. My question is, why are people with a military background have closely connected to the president's seats, and why have not more religious figures, especially those with an Islamic background, becomes president, even though I think more than 8% of Indonesian population is Muslim? I think it would be easier for them to gain public support. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Again, please, any question? Okay, come to microphone.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Before that, I will introduce myself first. My name is Zadin Aisyah, and I'm from International Relations Program Study. And then, before that, thank you for the insightful presentation from Mr. and Sir and Ma'am. For Sir and Ma'am, I'd like to ask question related to maritime law in enforcement in Indonesia. As mentioned before, Indonesia does not yet have a specific maritime court. Carefully, maritime cases such as ship workers or cargo disputes are handled by different court with different courts, which can cause overlapping decision. In your opinion, how important is it for Indonesia to establish a dedication maritime court to ensure legal certainty and efficiency in maritime dispute resolution? And do you think other countries with established maritime courts can be a model of Indonesia to adopt similar system? I think that's it. Thank you. I'd really appreciate your opinion and your answer to these matters. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Okay. Thank you. And we have 2 questions, Prof. Beck and Captain. Maybe Prof. Beck have a answer about the maritime court first. Please answer.
I was hoping that we might hear from the captain on the maritime court issue.
Okay.
I would just say that I assume this is meaning domestically. Internationally, there are courts and arbitral tribunals that do exist that states can use for maritime dispute resolution. They don't always use them, but I'm afraid my knowledge of comparable domestic maritime courts is not good. So I'll defer to the captain. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Prof. Beck. And time for Captain KK for answering the two questions from participant. Please.
Yes, thank you, Professor Rebecca, for passing on the question to me. There is no denying the importance that the domestic laws to treat such non-state actors. Domestic laws and courts will not be applicable in case of state-to-state conflict or conventional warfare as we see it. But when we see non-state actors, so-called the non-traditional threat act players like terrorists, pirates, gun runners, drug dealers, human traffickers. Now, these are the issues we have not discussed here, though they are part of the maritime security. But apparently, the line taken was a little bit of a hard security issues. So, I had presumed that I will tackle the hard security issues, and Professor Rebecca will uh, talk about various non-traditional security issues, thereby making the whole thing as a holistic maritime security. I would say covering the holistic maritime security gamut in the Indo-Pacific, notwithstanding how it is panned out, generally as a hard security issue. There is absolute necessity for the domestic courts to be formed by the act of government, because in the absence of such domestic regulations, legislations, which generally conform to the international treaties, conventions, and the laws like laws of the seas, IMO conventions, and various other international legislations on the subject. Because unless you have domestic jurisdiction, you will not be able to punish the perpetrators. Now, in a case where the definition of terrorism, there is no worldwide definition of terrorism. It is very difficult for even states to follow courts, or I would say make courts or make legislations where there is no international I would say effort to define terrorism and accordingly prosecute such terrorists. So we have been seeing that the so-called terrorists have been only prosecuted by instruments of state power most of the time. But I will give you India's example. Now, of course, when the terrorists cross over into the land boundary, it is very clear they are treated as having violated the India's territorial sanctity, and they can be treated under Indian law. The pirates and the piracy in the Gulf of Aden had become a huge problem between 2008 and 2012, and there was no law in India to prosecute the pirates. As a result, the Indian courts were hamstrung or limited by their ability to dispense justice to the pirates. So Indian agency used to catch huge amount of pirates in the high seas or in the EZ of various countries, bring them to the Indian shores, particularly in Mumbai. And now, under the existing laws, which did not have any specific provisions to prosecute the pirates, they were handed over to the police station. And after the police station, the courts did not know what to do, and they just languished, or they were just let loose, or they simply languished in Indian prisons. India is a big country, and dispensing justice in time itself is a bit of a problem. So they would either just languish in our prisons without trial, or to circumvent that, they'll just be left quietly. Now the India's piracy bill was mooted in that time, but ours is a very peculiar system. When the tenure of the of that body, that parliamentary body, for that 5 years finishes, and if there are some pending regulations, they also lapse. So they lapsed in 2012, and again now India has promulgated a anti-piracy law, under which if the pirates are caught, they are prosecuted under Indian law, under the provisions newly created. So there is no denying the fact. I actually no denying the fact that the courts have to be strengthened by the constitutional provisions passed by the particular country. I wonder when the Chinese fishing boat was burnt, it was burnt uh, under court orders, or it was burnt as an executive order of the president, or how did it happen? So that would be for an interesting case study. I never went into that particular aspect. So that's about the courts. Uh, Coming to the first question, that's a very slippery slope, I would say, because we have seen the example of Iran, where the Shah was deposed long time back by a cleric and the religious order, and then there has been a certain degree of, I would say, for want of a correct word, apprehension on the part of the rest of the world as to what path our uh, religious head dominated country would take, which direction it would take, whether it would be in consonance with the general good order and so-called naval discipline, as we call it, of the global world, or it would go in some other direction. So, like Chinese themselves have been trying to propagate the advantages of their own single party communist rule, though it has got nothing to do with religion. So, I would, on the whole, say that a large amount of countries which are not headed by such religious people or even military people also have one tracked mind, and that is why I had talked about uh, deterrence in the way that I had talked about. Now, if that is not the whole of, I would say, nation approach. So the power in the hands of either military people or religious people, or by any or in the hands of any unilateral authority like Communist Party, would not be in the best interest of the that nation particularly, and in general for the rest of the body. So, as I said, I would not like to uh, provide any specific answer to the question asked, but my ideas that I feel with regard to a religious head, a military head, or a titular head of a single party kind would not be very beneficial to the global order. So I will leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Captain Kamlesh. And any question again in this room or the committee in the Zoom chat? Any question? With the checkbox on the Zoom, please check. Okay. Now have question in the Zoom in this room. Okay, next.
Good morning. Let me introduce myself. My name is Izadin from International Relations student. I have the question. As we know, our topic focus today, how about the China's impact and China's Navy effect. Nah, but as we know, in Diego Garcia, as the joint military base of the UK and US is near into Indonesia and to India, maybe 1,000 miles to Indonesia and to India. My question is do this military base can keep the stabilization of the Indo-Pacific, or give the disruption for India and Indonesia? I want to know about the Miss Rebecca's perspective as Australian and Captain Kamlesh as Indian. And the second question, especially for Captain Kamlesh, I want to ask how can Indonesia and India leverage technology cooperation and intelligence exchange to mitigate maritime security threat arising from the activities of China's military or research vessels in the region. Thanks for me. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Izadin. Next. Okay.
Oke, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Let me introduce myself. My name is Novera Lutfiani. Please call me Via or Vera. And thank you for the presenters for inciting materials today. And actually, I'm gonna asking about Professor Rebecca. Recommendation in the last slide of PowerPoint. It's, if I'm not wrong, it tell about we need to discuss this conflict with United States or China. Actually, it's very interesting for me because we know since the Cold War, during the Cold War, there is two dominated power, which is Soviet and also United States. But if we discuss the conflict and then we want to know about that the opinion about this conflict, is that possible that that country it can be influence the developing country in the Indo-Pacific region, something like that. And then if that thing happen, for example, there is a dominating and then giving a founded and supported it again, is that make the more harder to prevent the conflict, something like that, because they are getting the money from the majority or the big power country, something like that. Thank you. That's all my question.
Okay, thank you, Novera. And I will let Professor Beck to first answering first the two questions, and then next, Captain Kamlesh. Please, Professor Rebecca, time is yours.
Sure, and thank you again for great questions, very thought-provoking questions. On Diego Garcia, I mean, that's a really interesting case given that the UK has signed over sovereignty to Mauritius, but has managed to do the deal in such a way that the US retains the lease over Diego Garcia. And that's been a really interesting example of maritime and territorial dispute resolution, and a good example actually of dispute resolution. So sometimes I think that we can be very focused on all of the intractable disputes in the maritime domain, like the South China Sea, but actually the Indo-Pacific region, there's good examples of where countries are able to resolve disputes by finding ways of negotiating around their tensions and their disagreements. I think Australia would like the United States to maintain its presence in the Indian Ocean region via the Diego Garcia base. It is also, of course, when we think about the Indian Ocean region and Australia's perspective on the Indian Ocean region, it hasn't always paid the region enough attention. It's tended to focus on the Pacific and it's tended to focus on Southeast Asia. It is now, over the last decade or so, turning westward and thinking much more about the Indian Ocean, although it needs to be doing much more, I think, in that regard. But one of the interesting things about AUKUS is that it sets up Western Australian basing that the United States and the United Kingdom, that their submarines will be using and being able to operate out of. So that also has the ability to potentially change some of the strategic dynamics of the Indian Ocean region as well. But it highlights that Australia is increasingly thinking about the region and thinking about what China's doing in that region. Although, as I said, there's probably more work to be done in that regard. In terms of the recommendations, and if I understood this question correctly, and forgive me if I've misunderstood, but it's really about, you know, the fact that US and China are really the states that need to be convinced when it comes to conflict prevention, when it comes to great power conflict prevention. And there are countries that can play brokerage roles, like, you know, regional and middle powers, with talking with both the United States and China. And of course, there's always probably more opportunities to have communication channels between the United States and China particularly when it comes to managing crisis. But I think maybe your question was about elite co-option and what happens when the agency of smaller and middle powers might become damaged because they are heavily influenced by bigger powers. Maybe I've misunderstood that, but I think it is an important question to be asking and to be answering, because invasion is not the only way in which countries might seek to interfere or to take over countries. It's also through foreign interference and infiltration, and that is an important consideration as well. So I'm sorry if I've misunderstood that question. Happy to come back to it if I haven't quite done justice to the question.
Okay, thank you, Professor Beka. Next, Captain Kamlesh answering the two questions from participant. Time is yours.
The question about Diego Garcia was pretty clear cut, and I would share the same views with regard to the second question. I have not really understood as to what the intervention is required from our side. So I will answer the Diego Garcia question first, and maybe ask the young lady to again ask her question specifically as to what answers are expected. The Diego Garcia, in a way, is an extension of the Indian so-called archipelagic islands of the Maldives, of the Lakshadweep Islands, and then they go on to the Maldives. And of course, some of it is not visible, but it is same extension going on to the Diego Garcia, British Indian Ocean Territory. The US presence in Diego Garcia for many years has provided a modicum of stability and security in the region. Particularly, the US has been using that base for its submarine tenders, for its aircraft, and sometimes for sending its aircraft across the Indian so-called Indochina continental mass into the Pacific Ocean. So the big B-52 bombers, etc. If you see the Google Earth pictures of, say, Kadena Naval Base or bases in Okinawa, they are pretty open. You can count the number of aircraft which are standing on the tarmac and on the hangar side. And China having now the long-range missiles, so-called, which can target Guam, etc., and they can target these bases. Theoretically, one has to be prepared as a military man for the worst-case scenario. So the Diego Garcia provides a relative safety by way of distance for the US forces. And because it is there, US has been able to mount its many campaigns in Afghanistan, in Iran, or Iraq, or Kuwait campaign during the first Gulf War from Diego Garcia by using the assets ex Diego Garcia. And of course, till the Cold War ended, India was never seen to be, or never perceived to be, on the side of the US. But notwithstanding, after the Cold War has ended, there has been a great uh, improvement of ties, and it is only heading northwards with a great trajectory, till some kind of small hiccups have been observed in the very, very contemporary times. But both India and US are hopeful that these hiccups, or the called temporary obstacles to India-US partnership, will I would say, they will pass over. It's a small uh, aberrance of some kind. Now, U.S. presence in Diego Garcia provides stability not only to India and to Indian Ocean, also to the Indo-Pacific Ocean as a whole. As I said, the aircrafts, etc., are used to go across. The increased diplomatic as well as military cohesion and partnership between India and US has further lent credence to this particular US presence in Diego Garcia, because now India, which never used to be allowed to come anywhere near that island, is frequently invited to participate in uh, bilateral planning of various campaigns. India and US have signed four foundational agreements, which allows for ships and aircraft of each other's country to visit ports, use logistic facilities, etc. So, US presence in Diego Garcia is increasingly uh, making the whole maritime security architecture in the area to be quite strong. It lending good muscle to the area. So we are very much in favor of US presence in the Diego Garcia. And for some of you who do not know, we are directly negotiating with we means India is directly negotiating with Mauritius to also get some kind of visiting rights and usage rights of some of these. I won't say some of these facilities in Diego Garcia, but in nearby islands of Diego Garcia, so that we have we as India are projecting ourselves to be the regional first responders and security partners. So, if we are to live up to these particular two uh, roles that we have assigned to ourselves, and with US support in the area being there, and we can achieve much more with regard to the maritime security issues. So, that is my long answer to the short question, and maybe second question, if some clarity is there, we can answer it.
Okay, thank you, Captain Kamlesh. Before we move to next question, I will greeting our great dean from Social and Political Faculty, Professor Dr. Abdul Halik MAG, join us with Zoom meeting. Professor, you hear me clearly? Please, maybe you have anything to say hello with our speakers today. Time is yours.
Okay, thank you very much for Pak Mas Dimas, and thank you very much Prof. Beck Strating and Captain Kumar Agnihotri. Thank you very much for the best presentation, the amazing presentation, and also that it is the best moment for me, for us, especially for our lectures and our students, yeah, to learn more about what you said about the security and regional issue. That is very important and very amazing, your presentation. Yeah, thank you very much, Prof. Beck and Captain Kumar. And yeah, I have just from the Canberra and Sydney, yeah, in the May the September. So yeah, maybe anytime, maybe we can meet again, like in the last month in the Consul General Australia in Surabaya. And so maybe Captain Kumar, I don't know, Captain Kumar from Mumbai or from New Delhi?
From New Delhi,
Oh,
Professor,
Delhi.
and I came in
Yeah.
December
Oh,
to
yeah.
Surabaya. I came in
Oh,
December to
yeah.
Surabaya
Oh,
on Indonesian
yeah.
Navy's. It was a Red Cross event, ICRC
Oh,
event.
oh, yeah. Okay, maybe we can meet in Surabaya for offline. Maybe if you have a time. So, Professor Beck, if you have time, maybe don't forget to contact me because I have your contact. Yeah, Prof Beck. Yeah, we can meet here and discuss about something maybe, and maybe you can enjoy the view of Surabaya, view of Java, one of the best area in Indonesia. Maybe. Okay. Thank you very much for
Thank you.
Professor Beck and Captain Kumar. See you.
Thank you so much. I would love to come back to Surabaya.
Thank you, Professor Halik.
Yeah.
Thank you,
Please,
Professor
Mas
Halik.
Dimas, continue.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Abdul Halik. We will move to the last question from Novera. The two speakers not hear clearly your question. If you wanna, please repeat your question with short question and especially see what do you wanna ask. Please, time is yours.
Okay, thank you. So The first question that I want to ask is, if there is a great country want to um, no. I mean, like, if there is a discussion with US and China, and then we want to know about that perspective to resolve the problem, and then we want to follow if the conflict is success, and then we want to follow the way. It's maybe it's not the problem, but my question is, how if there is a country that getting influence from both superpower country, and then after that, if there is another conflict, it may be quite difficult to prevent, because they are maybe getting founded from both maybe. And yeah, it's like my worry about this recommendation, something like that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Novera. I have a point that the question from Novera, Mr. Captain KK and Prof. Beck. She asked about how the country around the world to facing the challenges between US and China, but in their operational in the state found maybe give some money or receive some money from US or China. So how we can facing the challenges or competition between the two state, the power state. And if then any question in this room, let me ask you about my paper, Prof. Beck and Captain. As an information that in 2020, I have studied in Indonesian Defense University, specifically in Maritime Security Study Program. Then when it's 2020, we believe that Indonesian just built in maritime domain awareness, but until now, Indonesian still built about that. And Captain mentioned before that we must have about underwater domain awareness. So what do you think about happen if this MDA and UDA is not established quickly and accurately to Indonesia? And we have seen increasingly development of unmanned underwater vehicle or UUV in regional waters under the label of marine scientific research. How do you view the dual use nature of these technologies in term defense and surveillance? Do you think that the rise of autonomous underwater vehicle could blur or obstruct the line between civilian research and military intelligence gathering to the Indo-Pacific has become testing ground for many underwater surveillance technologies? And how, for Professor Beck, how can ASEAN strengthen this capacity to monitor and regulate this activity? Thank you.
So shall I go ahead first?
I forgot that I am the moderator. Please, Prof. Beck, and next, Captain KK for answering that two questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you again for those questions. I mean, I think, so again, this question goes back to how great powers might seek to influence other countries, and there's lots of techniques that countries use, whether it's trade, leverage and economic coercion, or whether it's through aid and development funding, or whether it's through infrastructure. So obviously, if we're thinking about China and China's influence, the Belt and Road Initiative is one example where a country is seeking to sort of develop its influence with other countries in the region. And that can have an effect in an institution like ASEAN, where you have quite diverse countries, and those countries have different relationships with great powers. You have some that are closer to the United States. So, for example, the Philippines is a treaty ally of the United States. Singapore also is pretty close to Washington. You have states that are hedging between their relationship. They will have economic and military defense cooperation relationships with the United States and with China, but they don't necessarily want to choose. And then you have, of course, other countries that might be bandwagoning with China within ASEAN. And so you have an institution that needs to grapple with that complexity and that diversity. This is part of strategic competition. The ability to influence elites, to influence business, to influence non-state actors and publics, so citizens of other countries, is all part of strategic competition. What the captain was talking about with DIME, for example, you have diplomacy is about influence, and information is about influence as well. And so I'm not quite sure I've also answered the direct question, but rather to say that and it's not just great powers, regional powers, middle powers, small powers, seek to influence other countries using a variety of different levers. And that is an important consideration when it comes to geopolitics, and when it comes to international affairs in the region. ASEAN maritime domain awareness is an important, I think, issue area for Southeast Asian countries. I would note that the Quad as a minilateral has focused on maritime domain awareness as a key issue through IPMDA, the Indo-Pacific Maritime Domain Awareness, providing data and trying to coordinate between different sources of information. There is, regional fusion centers that are important for trying to develop greater awareness. This is obviously an important issue for countries in the region who are dealing with day-to-day maritime governance and law enforcement issues, being able to see what's going on the seas, but also, underwater. Is an important part of how countries can protect their entitlements and to be able to enforce law within their maritime zones. And there are lots of opportunities, I think, for better coordination. I think, though, that one of the real issues when it comes to non-traditional security challenges and dealing with blue crimes is what happens with that information. So it's all very well and good to have a greater picture of what's going on the seas or beneath the surface of the water. But that has to be able, states have to do something with that. And I think that the biggest capability gaps tend to be in things like coast guards, the legal gaps, being able to actually enforce the law through a judicial system. And that often requires cooperation between countries, which is not always easy to do. And so there are, I think, a lot of opportunities for ASEAN countries as a regional bloc to not just be thinking about maritime domain awareness or underwater domain awareness, but thinking in a more coordinated fashion about what they do with the information they have in order to be able to strengthen the sovereign capabilities of countries to enforce their maritime zones. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. And we move to hear answer from Captain KK. Please, time is yours.
Yeah, thank you, moderator. You have asked a very, very pertinent question, and the question is very dear to my heart, particularly with respect to Indonesia's importance. I saw during my presentation that you were flashing the excerpts of my previous interviews of 2023, wherein I had highlighted again and again the strategic importance of Indonesia for maritime security of India. Now I will give you I will expand on that further. The submarines are the best platforms for carrying out warfare because of their stealth factor. Now, India is really worried about the Chinese submarines coming into the Indian Ocean. We all know that if the Strait of Malacca is used, The United Nations Convention on Law of the Sea says that the submarines must transit international straits on surface flying their flag. Now, if the submarine comes through the Strait of Malacca, India is already having its eyes in the sky, and India can thereafter do the calculations with regard to time and distance and know from the Strait of Malacca where the submarine could have gone with regard to India in the Indian Ocean. Now, to obviate this situation, a submarine would like to come into the Indian Ocean somehow undetected. Now, if it has to come undetected into the Indian Ocean, so that India does not have the initial point of reference from where the submarine dived and is going to create a threat to India. So then it must come dived through one of the straits. Malacca Strait is out of question because of density of traffic, not enough depth, and not enough uh, and so much of traffic. Submarines themselves are at risk when they do this dive thing, and it is a contravention to the UNCLOS. So the best strait and deepest strait is the Lombok Strait. And if Indonesia, US, India, Australia, it is beneficial to everybody. If we can have some kind of a unified action plan wherein US provides the technology, we provide the other legal wherewithal, and the straits, the seabed under the straits, the underwater sensors are put there. Japan, Taiwan, and US have put these kind of sensors in the straits on the other side, wherever they feel that the Chinese submarines will break out from. Now, if this kind of thing happens, then that intelligence that you talked about will be of huge value, not only to the US, to India, to Australia, to rest of the world. That because then we can know the where the submarine went. Firstly, did the submarine cross or not? Now, once it has crossed, then we can again start doing time and calculations. Somebody talked about Diego Garcia. So there is US presence, US and India in partnership. Australia also is a very much an Indian Ocean power, and in partnership can actually look at prosecuting these submarines, or at least tracking these submarines in a concerted, unified way. So that is the military angle that I wanted the students to understand with regard to what is the importance of Indonesia. Now, for some reason, Indonesia wants to preserve its strategic autonomy. So this thing is not making much headway. But that is why researchers and analysts like us through in the think tanks always like to project this as an aspirational thing, that if it happens, it will improve the maritime security situation for all concerned in the Indo-Pacific in the region. With regard to the maritime scientific research using the underwater vehicles, unmanned vehicles, manned submersibles, unmanned submersibles, India has already greatly worried. China has a legally allocated space of Madagascar of 10,000 square kilometers, wherein the United Nations has given them the allocation for carrying out deep water research. Now, all these vessels cross the Malacca Strait, and then they go and deploy these manned and unmanned submersibles. The ships are going to and fro all over the place, putting their underwater vehicles down, and they are collecting data, hydrological data, salinity, seawater salinity, temperature, density data. This data, when fed into a supercomputer, brings out the best hiding areas in the Indian Ocean for the submarines. So the data which is collected in peacetime by deep sea research vessels and their embarked manned submersibles as well as unmanned submersibles, this peacetime data collection activity directly feeds into the Chinese maritime war preparedness in under sea or so-called submarine warfare. Now, if you put the two things together, uh, not only India but rest of the countries in the Indo-Pacific have to be worried about this activity being conducted. So, definitely the line between the wartime activities and peacetime activities is getting blurred. There is no doubt about it. All that is required is to be done is to recognize this particular fact by everybody. So I will, that is the question with regard to this. The influence operations that the lady had, now I've got a little clarity what she wants to ask. And I would put it in the recent uh, turmoil that happened in Bangladesh. Now, a lot of it is speculative that in Bangladesh, somebody said the regime change happened because of US influence. People talked about how US wanted a, this is all speculative. A lot of conspiracy theories come into these issues. How US wanted an island which Sheikh Hasina would not give to US, and then senior US people visited there, and thereafter regime change happened. On the other hand, they said that the Chinese influence in the Chinese influence, economic influence, so-called money that they are giving, we call it financial support in a more refined language, uh, and influence building operations through friendship bridges, friendship railway, friendship this and friendship that. Uh, Maybe the Chinese engendered it. Now, notwithstanding the fact that Sheikh Hasina presently resides in India, the example is that how the country like Bangladesh, which was supposed to be progressing along pretty well on the GDP growth index, simply disintegrated as a country in a way. I wouldn't call it disintegrated, the regime disintegrated in a way which is not beneficial to anybody in that country as well as in the region. So countries have to guard against. In case of India, when you come to it, we know that the India's northeast for many years has been again speculative. That has been influenced by various actors through Myanmar and through Bangladesh itself by Chinese influence. There is no hard and fast facts to prove that. Again, it is quite speculative. So Chinese influence in the Indian territory from the northeast has been as cause for concern because we have to guard against it. On the other hand, the various NGOs, there have been allegations on various NGOs funded by Western powers, particularly the US, that the money which is being coming through these such NGOs is being misutilized by certain companies and certain bodies to create uh, instability or opposition to issue based things. It's like that Russian funded nuclear power plants in south of India. There was a huge protest, and that protest was attributed to this money coming in through the such NGOs, and those NGOs mobilizing popular people's, I would say, protests. Now again, speculative and it's a conspiracy theory. I would like to call it that, but there is some. I'm sure the track one government has its own reasons for stopping these funds. So the countries have to guard against, countries and regions have to guard against the competing influences that these two powers. Just as a caveat, I would say for a long time, US believed that India was under Russia's influence till the Cold War got over. So I guess this is how the global real politic works, and the best way to ensure safeguard your interests is by uh, looking out for these trends and trying to stop them and nip them in the bud itself. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Captain, for the great answer. My question, and I will remind the Zoom participant have a question. Please raise your hand. Use your future raise hand in the Zoom, maybe. Okay, no have question. Then in here have a question again. Okay. Okay. Thank you very much to our deepest appreciation for our speakers today, Prof. Beck and Captain Kamlesh, for that insightful and excited discussion. Oh, you have a question? Oh, okay, please. The last question. Sorry, Professor and Captain, we have the last question.
Check.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. The first one, I'll say good afternoon for Mr. Imam President, Mr. KK, and Miss Rebecca. And second, so I'll say good afternoon for the audience. Okay. The first one, I'll say thank you so much for the president of the speakers. Okay. Just time. Mr. KK talk about India's maritime policy, right? Okay. In our materials, in International Institute have two actors. They are non-state actors and state actors. Okay. So my question is, does India make a cooperate with non-state actors? If yes, how many percentages of responsibility can be given to non-state actors? I think that's all. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. I think question for Captain KK. Captain KK, for answering, time is yours.
What I understand from the person who is asking the question is that he is projecting the non-state actors in the positive light with regard to uh, NGOs, various think tanks, various other bodies. Uh, if that is so, it is very much the government efforts, the government policy, whether it is in the maritime domain or whether it is in any domain, is always bolstered by the views of such non-state actors, uh, which are in support of the government or which are supporting the policy and which are privately criticizing, if the policies are required to be criticized, privately criticizing the policies and offering suitable alternatives. So such non-state actors are with internal to the country as well as outside the country are very much welcome to uh, contribute to the efforts of the track one, to the efforts of the government. However, of late in international relations circuit, the non-state actors have come to indicate a negative connotation rather than a positive one, and these connotations obviously relate to the unlawful and illegal activities of such non-state actors. And I just mentioned some of them: drug running, uh, gun running, human trafficking, piracy, terrorism, uh, various other things. So these are the things which have to be guarded against. But since I presume your question is with regard to the positive uh, contribution of the non-state actors, I have already said my piece. Thank you.
Thank you, Captain KK. Once again, thank you for exciting discussion for this session. And thank you all of participants for your active engagement throughout the session. And I'm sorry if there are any mistake because this is my day one as the moderator in international conference. And I'm pleased to return the floor to our master ceremony to continue the next program. Thank you. Have a good day. Wallahul muwaffiq ila aqwamit thoriq. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. See you at the next international conference in the next years.
Thank you. Terima kasih. Goodbye. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure speaking to the students over such a long interactive session. Thank you, Dr. Rebecca.
Thank you too, Captain. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you so much for the interesting presentation by Captain Kamlesh Kumar Agnihotri and Professor Rebecca Strating. And now let us witness the certificate handover and photo session. To operator team, please get ready to take a screen capture for the certificate handover session. And for Captain Kamlesh Kumar Agnihotri, please stay on your screen for a moment as we capture this memorable moment together. Thank you. to the operator team. Okay. And we would like to remind the admin to please capture the screen. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much to the organizers.
Dear
So,
all participants, before we enter the parallel session, we would like to remind you to fill out the attendance form of day 2 and please write down your email correctly so you can receive the certificate. Thank you. Thank you for Captain Kumar.
thank you so much. It has been pleasure interacting with you. So I shall log out. Right. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Captain.
For admin, please visualize the barcode. Oke, untuk seluruh peserta diharapkan untuk segera mengisi sertifikat formnya karena kita akan melanjutkan sesi berikutnya. Eh, Mungkin bisa difoto terlebih dahulu. Mungkin bisa difoto terlebih dahulu. Nanti aku sudah. Oke. Langsung ya. Okay, to close the planner session, let us sing the song Bagimu Negeri together. The audience is requested to stand up and put your right hand on your left shoulder. you. Ladies and gentlemen, please be seated.
Dear ladies and gentlemen, for the next agenda is break time for an hour. Before entering our break time, the presenters are not allowed to leave the Zoom meeting because we will have the parallel session.
We inform to all presenters are requested to change your Zoom meeting name to the number of the room you are in, your full name, and your institution. For the example, room 1 underscore Sadia Turahima underscore UIN Sunan Ampel Surabaya, because our admin will put you in each correct room.
For the parallel session, we will be having 5 breakout rooms. The first room for topic climate-induced migration and the politics of resilience, social conflict, energy food crisis policy, and authoritarian control in vulnerable regions.
Second rooms with the topic State Capacity and Environmental Governance in Fragile Democracies.
The third room for topic political movement and activism for equitable access to food and energy geopolitics of energy transition and global resilience strategies.
Fourth room, War and Conflict Prevention in Multipolar World.
The fifth room for topic resilient multilateralism for sovereignty and peace building, international aid, maritime security, and global supply chains amid food energy shocks.
Ladies and gentlemen, we look forward to your attendance on time at 1 p.m. GMT plus 7.
Thank you. All right, while we have our break time, the profile video of FISIP UINSA will entertain all of you.
Oke, baik. Kepada seluruh peserta, agenda berikutnya adalah istirahat, break time. Oke, terima kasih.
Terima kasih atas kehadirannya. Semoga bermanfaat. See you at the next year of SAICoPSS 2026. Yeah. Thank you, everyone. Please wait for the certificate.